Welcome to Goodwin Law Unplugged, Florida real estate and more. This podcast features candid insight from real estate industry professionals from all sectors. Your host, attorney Matthew Goodwin, a native Floridian and experienced real estate attorney, will provide his personal insight on legal matters and feature other professionals offering their candid advice. Whether you're a first-time homebuyer, seasoned investor, or experienced real estate agent, there is something for everyone. Thanks for joining us on Goodwin Law Unplugged.
Well, hey there, Charlie McDermott, co-host of the show, back in the Goodwin Law studio with none other than Matt Goodwin. Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Charlie. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing terrific. And speaking of the Goodwin Law studio, you've got new digs there, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. It was, I got to see it at the, the open house / grand opening that you did a while back. And then I stopped by, which is going to lead us into today's topic. But what a place. Congratulations once again.
Thank you. We're really excited about it. We moved in this summer and spent a few months tearing the place apart and putting it back together, moving things, walls, you name it, and changing everything from the baseboards to some of the door handles. And we're really excited. It's 3 times the space of our old office. It's about a quarter mile north of Mercado, right on the corner of 41 and 99th Avenue North. If you look over at when the sun goes down, you'll see a big bright sign that says Goodwin Law.
I love it. And that is an awesome sign. You can't miss it, which is great because it's easy to get lost in the North Naples area. So, or for that matter, anywhere, especially for us newbies. Although we're here now 7 years, so I guess we can't be new anymore. But I still
you can act like it, and some people still do. Some people never fully acclimate. They still think they're driving in New Jersey.
Yeah. All right, so I stopped by not too long ago, just a few weeks ago, and we got to chatting. And as you now know, because you're heavily involved in my settlement, we decided to move from our Fort Myers Beach location and over to Ave Maria. And you opened my eyes to some things that are going on from a consumers' rights, I guess, from standpoint in choosing settlement companies and how that all goes down. Obviously, you're the expert there, so I thought this would be a great topic to get into today.
Yeah, so most people know they have a choice of their realtor, and you can you can sell your property with the realtor or you can sell it without, and there's multiple options you have there. But after you get to the point of contract, you have additional choices available to you that most people don't realize, unless they've done it before, sold property or bought property, or their realtors educated them, or they contacted a real estate attorney before going on a contract. And that only classifies a certain percentage of the population. So one of the big, so there's a few terms I'm going to use. I want to make sure you understand what they are. One, you have a title company, right? But you also have title agents that don't always work for title companies. A law firm, for instance, can function like a title company by serving as the title agent. Okay, so that's one role. You need a title agent. Second, you need an escrow agent. And third, you hear a couple different terms used interchangeably: a closing agent, settlement agent. Mm-hmm. If you look at the contract, those are not all. There's not a place for every one of those roles. The contract identifies the escrow agent, and that's because it's important to know where your money is going to be held. And so that's the first choice that you have. Who is going to be the escrow agent? Now, 95% of the time, the escrow agent will also be the title agent and the closing agent. And depending on who you talk to, the settlement agent, right? So title agent, escrow agent, closing agent, settlement agent, they all fall under the same outfit 95% of the time. So if you chose Goodwin Law as your escrow agent, most likely we would be the closing agent, the settlement agent, and the title agent. And most consumers don't understand that because they may come from a state where there's no title companies. And they think there has to be a lawyer named in the mix. Well, in a lot of cases, the lawyer is simply serving as a fiduciary to the transaction by reason of being the escrow agent named in the contract or the closing agent. Now, the choice you have is there. The choice is there, but it's dictated by a couple of things. And this is what you really need to be aware of, depending on where you're buying or selling property. One is the form of contract that's used, and B is the local customs. Now, I'll explain to you what I mean by that. In Florida, you have 3 or 4 different variations of contracts used for the majority of real estate transactions. One is called the Florida Realtors Florida Bar, or for shorthand, it's called the FAR Bar contract. And another one is called the CRISP. Another one is called NEFAR for the Northeast Florida Association of Realtors. You see that used in Northeast Florida, for instance, but not in too many places. And then you have the NABOR contract, which down in Southwest Florida is used almost exclusively in Naples and the surrounding areas in Collier County. So NABOR stands for Naples Area Board of Realtors. Now, in Lee County, right next door, the Florida Realtors / FAR Bar contract is predominantly used. And they're very, very different in terms of the choices that you have. So Lee County, FAR Bar contract, 95% of the time it's used, has a checkbox. Checkbox, you can select that the seller chooses the closing agent. The buyer chooses the closing agent. If you check nothing, then it's a big question mark. And the assumption would be that whoever's identified in your settlement, in your escrow agent field, would be your closing agent. But it can sometimes be altered even after the fact. So if there's an escrow agent named in the contract and the seller signs that contract, signs that offer, but then identifies who the closing agent will be after you're already under contract, and in some cases, even after the buyer makes their deposit with the escrow agent, the seller can say, it's my choice. We're in Lee County, and the custom here is that the seller picks the closing agent / title agent.
Okay.
Now, the buyer can still have their own escrow agent used. You have a binding contract, the escrow agent's identified. But remember, the choice after the contract is signed hinges on a couple of different things. One, the form of contract, and 2, whether there's a checkbox picked at all. Now, when you're working with a real estate agent, you will seldom not have a box checked. The only time you'll usually see it is for simple oversight or maybe inexperience. And in Lee County, the general custom is that the seller picks the closing agent. So think of this scenario. You're buying property in Lee County, the FAR Bar contract is used. You put seller picks because you're in Lee County, and the seller signs that contract. Well, the checkbox that you made was not choosing the escrow agent. The checkbox was that you made was selecting that the seller chooses the closing agent. So we've had situations where that exact scenario took place in Lee County. The buyer's deposit has been made with their designated escrow agent in the contract. And the seller says, well, wait a minute, this here says it's my choice, and I'd like Goodwin Law to be our closing agent. And most of the time when that happens, depending on what stage in the contract you're in, how many days have passed, for instance, in the buyer's chosen escrow company will sometimes transfer that escrow because most if not all, title companies do not simply serve as escrow agent.
They do it all, in other words.
They'll do it all or nothing.
Yep. Okay. Got it.
Now, in Florida, you don't have many escrow companies, but we're contacted a few times a year for somebody wanting to hold the money at our office. And unless we're handling the closing or we're providing legal representation for that buyer or seller, let's say in a commercial transaction, we wouldn't just hold the money in our account. Now, there's strategic reasons why the buyer may put their law firm, their preferred law firm down, or even the buyer's real estate brokerage, the buyer's agent's brokerage company. You don't see too many brokerages holding escrow on the West Coast. In the East Coast, where we do business as well, you will still see that from time to time. There's just some old school brokers that will hold escrow. They're written in on the contract. And then the closing agent, someone completely different. If that happens, once the contract is signed, your choices are limited. But that's why you got to understand what you sign before you know what your choices are. Does that make sense?
Yeah. A follow-up question to that would be, do real estate agents ever put title companies on the contract for the seller, with the assumption that, hey, we've taken care of that for you? Or is that always left blank?
That's a great question, Charlie. And I think that most realtors would always put who they prefer and hope that the seller agrees to it. But here's where a smart agent can stand out, or experience comes through when they add additional terms to the contract. One of those additional terms would be that the escrow agent shall be the closing agent. If you have those terms in that same scenario that I described, and the seller signs the contract, the seller's locked in to using that escrow agent as closing agent.
Wow. Okay.
And the seller and the consumer's choice is no longer existent. Now, if you look at the buyer as the consumer, then the consumer has more control, but based on what they know about the form of contract they're using, and the local custom.
Okay. And that's Lee County, correct?
That's Lee County. And so just to come full circle with your question, if the buyer's agent and the seller's agent, so selling and listing agent, however you look at them, however you title them, are with the same brokerage, you will sometimes see the buyer's agent make that choice in advance, who they know the seller would agree to, because they both work with this entity because of their brokerage. There are some brokerages in town that do that. But when the buyer's agent and the seller's agent are from two different brokerages, the buyer's agent will almost always put their preferred. And sometimes you'll see in the MLS, there's a field that only realtors can see, or licensed agents can see, that designates the settlement agent or settlement company. Even if, so in some cases they can state, the listing agent can state the seller's preference in the confidential remarks and the MLS listing, which doesn't always take away the consumer's choice. It just puts down what the seller is requesting, or in some cases demanding or requiring. And then it comes down to being negotiable, because everything is negotiable. Now, I have agents that work with buyers in Lee County where, remember, it's typically the seller picks there in Lee County, and they'll put their preferred company down, and then the listing agent will simply line through it as a matter of course and say, we're in Lee County, you will use who we say you will use. Done. Now, you'll see the same thing happen in Palm Beach County. You'll see the same thing happen in many other counties across the state. Now, let's look at the other side of the equation. I'll take, for instance, NABOR. I want to make sure you understand the two things I just explained. One, the form of contract, and two, the local custom. Does that make sense to you, how that dynamic works?
Yeah, it does. And you know, what stands out to me is, my goodness, you know, when you're thinking about, I mean, you know how fast, quickly my transaction went. You know, to have this conversation, maybe even before you list your property, or look at buying a property with your real estate attorney, because yeah, it sounds like, depending on where you are, and I know you practice all over the state, right? So that's why you mentioned Palm Beach County, and I know you do a lot of work in Tampa and so forth. So, you know, those local jurisdictions will, you know, the rules change, I guess, is the long and the short of it, correct?
Yes, and you can find the local custom out. Let's say you're buying property in a distant county. You can Google the terms, Florida title company, who pays by county, and there's an
Yeah.
infographic you'll see pop up with the state of Florida and two different. It's color coded, so you can see whether you're in a seller pick county or a buyer pick county. So that's a little way to cheat in learning about other customs.
Okay.
So if that makes sense to you, I'll talk to you about the NABOR contract, because you will still see that used sometimes in Lee County, and that's where I want to make a couple distinctions. So the NABOR contract does not have checkboxes, number one. So the default terms are already decided for you. And so and here's how it works. If you use the NABOR contract in Collier County, the buyer picks, and that's also in line with the local custom. If somebody brought a FAR contract to buy property in Collier County and they checked the seller pick, they would get the same pushback that they got in Lee County if the buyer put down who they wanted to use. Okay. So stay with me, because this is where it's really important. If you use the NABOR contract in Lee or Charlotte counties, you may hardly ever see it used in Charlotte, but there is language in there. The buyer picks the closing agent, but the seller pays the premium for the owner's title insurance policy. If the buyer uses the NABOR contract to make an offer in Lee County, the buyer it has the choice by designating it in the contract or even after the fact, but the seller pays for the premium of the owner's title policy. So think of this scenario. Buyer uses NABOR contract to buy a property in Bonita Springs. Well, Bonita Springs has city limits on both counties. It's split. I think it's somewhere around Old 41, and north of there is Lee County, south of there is Collier County.
Jeez.
Now, first page of the contract is where you will put the property address, legal description, and the county that the property is located in. If you get that right, then the next portion of that is knowing the form of contract and the default terms. I've seen agents write contracts on the NABOR contract, or write offers on the NABOR contract for a Lee County property, put their escrow agent in, and seller signs it. Seller says, wait, we're in Lee County, or the listing agent a lot of times is the one who says that. Buyer says, wait, look at this section of the contract. It says here, if the property's in Lee County, Lee or Charlotte County, the buyer chooses, but the seller pays. In some cases, they don't even find out till they get to closing, and their settlement fees are more on the side of the seller. They're higher for the seller.
Wow. Right.
So to bring this full circle and to clarify one thing I don't really think I talked about, you have the choice of who is your closing agent, but that choice corresponds with payment for the owner's premium title policy. There's two large fees aside from real estate commissions that are paid in most real estate transactions in Florida. That's the documentary stamp tax, which mostly is borne by the seller unless it's a new construction. Whereas most builders put that on the buyer. And then you have the premium for the owner's policy of title insurance. So remember, in those seller pick counties, and Palm Beach County is a big county with very expensive properties, right? And many other counties have this. Seller picks and pays for both this doc stamps on the sale, on the deed, and the owner's premium, or the premium for the owner's policy of title insurance.
So generally, we're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars. I mean, depending on the size of the transaction that you could be paying if you're not aware of this. I mean, this is
You absolutely
oh,
can. And I actually had a transaction close a couple of weeks ago, and the buyer was working with an agent. The agent educated him on who pays for these expenses. And then after closing, the buyer emailed us and and points us to the contract that says the seller pays this fee. But what the buyer overlooked is two things. One, where the property was located, and two, the form of contract that was used. So they simply misread and misread after the fact and misinterpreted before the fact. So when you're buying property, most of the time, the last thing you're thinking about is these kinds of details, right? You're thinking price, closing date, down payment, inspection, personal property. There's a lot of things. So your mind's already cluttered. And if you're financing it, that adds a whole nother layer of complexity, not to mention the stress involved with moving or whatever the circumstances. So that's why it's important to understand what your choices are, because like you said, it could mean the difference of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. And that's a tough time to realize it at the settlement table or thereafter.
It is. It absolutely is.
Wow.
So remember, you have a few things we talked about. You have a choice as to who the escrow agent is. That choice can be challenged by local customs, but also can be negated by how checkboxes exist and are checked off depending on the form of contract. But then you also have the ability to negotiate and add special terms. So you could, if you find yourself in a county where the local custom is opposite from what you prefer, then you can add special terms to the contract. I'll give you one more example. If you're selling your property without a realtor, which a lot of people are doing right now, I don't recommend it, by the way. If you do, make sure you're working with a real estate attorney in all aspects. But if you are not using a realtor and you want to add special terms, then make sure you work with a real estate attorney. And you could flip it. You could say in your contract, as part of your deal, that the buyer pays the doc stamps and you as the seller will pay for the premium and choose the closing agent. So you can change the terms in a contract from what the boilerplate says, regardless of whether there's checkboxes. But I don't recommend trying to do that on your own without the assistance of a licensed real estate attorney.
Okay. Wow. Man, you covered a lot of ground. One last question, I guess. I mean, it seems like whether you live in Lee or Collier County, either contract could be applied to the transaction, right? Exactly. So is there, I mean, all things being equal, is there a benefit to using one over the other, regardless of where you live?
That is a highly debated question. And I'll give you my 2 cents, because the custom is so ingrained as to who picks and the form of contract used. I think you're at a benefit by using the NABOR contract in Collier County. And I think you're at an equal benefit of presenting offers on the FAR contract in Lee County. But that's not intended to dissuade anyone from using the NABOR contract in Lee County or Charlotte County. Yeah. But what happens is if it's a property listed on the MLS, that means there's usually a licensed realtor on the other side. Usually, not always, usually. There are websites that will serve as your broker, but they don't do anything else, like flatfee.com and maybe a couple others. So if it's listed on the MLS, and there is an agent involved, they're going to challenge you if you use the contract that's not custom. Okay. in that community. Most of the time. Some even experienced agents might overlook that. Most agents that have been in the business more than 2 years, I'd say, or if they did a lot of business in their first year, they're going to know better when they see neighbor at the top or far bar.
Yeah. Wow. Man, you covered a lot today. Back to what I said midway through this episode, my Lord, what I learned in working with you and going through this, and we're in the middle of a settlement right now, is get an attorney, get someone who's knowledgeable, who can help you navigate all these potential challenges that, at some point, you sign the dotted line. In some cases, it could be too late. So be, I guess the word is proactive, right?
Right. And this is one thing I'll leave you with. The choice to pick your settlement agent, escrow agent, and the corresponding requirement to pay the premium is often valuable. There's often value to having control over the money and where the transaction goes. And a lot of that comes down to being comfortable with and knowing the people and the team that you're working with. I hear horror stories all the time. Oh, this title company that the buyer picked was horrible, or this title company that the seller picked is horrible. And I wish I'd known better, that I had a choice.
Yeah.
So the choices may cost the party that's picking more, but there's value in that decision.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Matt, really appreciate you carving out time this morning to go through all this. And for listeners who want to tap into Matt and his team there at Goodwin Law, let me just share your number, 239-207-3403. And again, Matt, you work all over the state of Florida, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome.
We have an office in Palm Beach County, people on the ground in Tampa, Sarasota, Cape Coral, and obviously Naples.
Yeah. Well, terrific. Well, until our next episode, keep helping folks like me, whether it be with their real estate transactions or other needs in the estate and probate law and so forth.
It'll be our pleasure. Thanks for your time, Charlie.
You got it. See you, Matt.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Goodwin Law Unplugged. To learn more about Goodwin Law and to utilize our services, visit GoodwinEstatelaw.com or call 239-207-3403. Hablamos Español. To submit questions or be a guest on a future episode, message us on our website or on social media by searching for Goodwin Law PA in Naples, Florida. This has been Goodwin Law Unplugged. Thanks again for joining us.